Hi, so this is part 3 of my series and the final part. I am going to do this last part on probably the biggest community of creepypasta right now, even though I highly doubt that they actually claim it to be creepypasta, but and what I've been saying with the claims of how you can tell creepypasta from not, this works really well in saying that yes, this is creepypasta. So we're going to be talking about the SCP Foundation. So the SCP Foundation, in reality, is a huge international. By that I mean that it's. I guess could be people coming from all over, but there are actual separate pages for each country, and they have their own SCPs based on basically what people from those countries want to write about. And it takes the form of a list of descriptions of anomalous objects, places, and people. And as of April 2021, there are over 6,000 curated entries on the main site. So that's the goal for reading every single one on that site. You either have a lot of time or I doubt you're going to be able to do it. So the history of the SCP Foundation, the real history, is actually really interesting. So the first SCP, SCP-173, which it's now called now, was first created for the forum 4chan in 2007, which, if you remember from my first part, actually predates Slenderman by about a year. This SCP was SCP-173, as I said, a sculpture that will move if not being constantly observed. And in 2008, the previously mentioned the SCP Wiki was created. The Wanderer's Library is a spin-off site of the SCP Foundation, and it was made to show off stories that are based off of SCP entries versus the main site being specifically SCPs. So this is basically like creepypastas that are closer to actual creepypasta. So it looks closer to what creepypastas actually are than what normal SCP entries look like. I just found about this when I was doing this project, and I was looking at it, and the site intro and its facts and questions could be a real critical thinking trap because they make no disclaimer that these stories are fake. They're playing it completely straight, like story wise, and I think that could be a big problem if people think that the SCP stuff is actually real. So I have some interesting SCPs, and these are pretty famous ones. There are a ton of famous ones, so I'm just going to go over. Pretty sure I have 7 in here. So SCP-294, the vending machine, is a vending machine that will give you any liquid you want. And by any liquid, I don't mean, something you can drink. No, I mean anything that could be a liquid. Like they tell stories about like liquid nitrogen or gold, and it's just like it's actually interesting to see what people who wrote this came up with. Like, oh yeah, it's liquid. um, SCP 4999 is death, and he's a man who gives company to people dying alone. This is actually one of my favorites because most of these are like, or at least most of the famous ones are like, oh, here's a giant monster that will come and kill you. And this is just like a man who's just like, I'm not gonna let you die alone. So it's like, I think that one's nice. And SCP-871 is multiplying cakes, which I have this nice picture here. I'm pretty sure that's not the actual picture they have on the site. I like it because it's got the cakes. Multiplying cakes. If you don't eat one, you will find another one tomorrow. So basically, if nobody will eat the cake, you will just have an apocalypse of cake after a while, and I think that's hilarious. Um, oh, and there's one more thing for the SCPs that I forgot to mention here. They separate the SCPs into three major categories. I think there are like 7 or 8 altogether, but most of them fit into the three major categories. So um, there's Safe, Euclid, and Keter. And Safe is basically if you leave it alone, it basically does nothing. So just leave it alone and it's cool. Euclid is basically unexplained, and we don't know whether it could hurt you or not. And then Keter is basically it could end the world. And funny enough, I think if I remember right, the cakes are Keter. So yes, Apocalypse by Cake, and it's hilarious. SCP-500 is the Miracle Pills, a pill that will cure any disease. But the problem is there's only a set amount of pills. So, um, this one, SCP-682, the Indestructible Reptile, an evil, unkillable monster. And this is actually one of the pictures of it, which also is critical thinking of you actually tried to draw a picture of it. So people might think that it's real. And 682 is probably the one, say 173 and 682 are probably the two most famous SCPs. And it's just like, oh yeah, I know that one. SCP 2521 is a monster that will kidnap anyone who knows anything about it. So if you write anything about it, if you talk about it, if you try to name it, it'll just like come out of nowhere and kidnap you. Just that's it. And SCP-1048 is called Builder Bear, which they did that pun on purpose. And it's a teddy bear that makes monster copies of itself. And so my last thing is SCP Sedition, and it's a YouTube series by a channel called Tat's Top Videos. It's a constructed interview series with different popular SCPs, with one of them being the SCP-682. And it's still important to know that even though that there is a lot of information about the SCP Foundation, it does not mean that SCPs are real. Even though people have written a lot about them, does not mean that, oh yeah, this is real. Which, when I was saying the whole time, just like, you gotta check your sources. When people are writing so much stuff about SCPs, it's difficult to kind of figure out what is the real source. So, I mean, if you're able to look at the SCPs and just like know that, oh yeah, this isn't real, but there is so much. Like, I think the only thing that helps is that the fact that, at least for the SCP Wiki, the main page, they do a good job of saying, like, on their facts and questions that this is not real. There are no SCPs or SCP Foundation. But other than that, I think that some people might have trouble using critical thinking, so it's still important to find sources and be able to know that SCPs and creepypastas in general are not real. And I hope that you were able to learn some things and have some enjoyment in these 3 videos. Okay, have a nice day.